Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We are so excited to have a very special guest with us today of the LitFest conference. And this person, this amazing lady, is one of the winners of the Strange Ink Book Awards 2023. So we had to have her on. We wanted to ask her about her winning book, An Ayah's Choice, which is a piece of historical fiction. She will tell us more about it, inshallah. But before we dive in, the first question I want to ask you, Sister Shahida, is what drives you to write?
A very good question. What drives me to write? Well, take me back about 14 years, I would say. I didn't really plan to become an author. I did a lot of reading during that time, and I was at home with my young children. And it's a story that my mother once mentioned. We were watching TV, and she said some of the men on the TV screen, so they were Asian seamen. She came out with a story saying that we had an ancestor who was probably worked on a steamship. And it was from that moment I thought, let me try and find out more about these men, which propelled me to do so. And probably within a month, I decided I'm going to write a story about these men. And when I sort of put myself in that position, I thought, this is a huge task. Where am I going to start? Because I was a new author, not even an author, I was a new writer, and just starting on the research. And then what I did, just wrote what came to my mind, and I developed a story. But I have to say it wasn't easy, but it just seems so long ago now, but alhamdulillah, it's got me where I am today.
Wow, subhanallah. So you heard about a story about your ancestors, and then you were inspired to write a historical fiction novel, right? So the name of this book is called An Ayah's Choice. Now, you said that you wrote about the men who were the seamen, and they had an amazing story. So how did those two ideas merge? Who was the protagonist? What made you go with that direction? Yeah.
So from the first book that was published in 2012, and I was looking at South Asian history. And at that time, I discovered that a lot of the stories were hidden. And I wanted to bring out those stories. I sort of focused on Indian women at the time. We're talking about Edwardian England, early 20th century, 1900. And I saw these stories where they worked as nannies for British families in British India, and they took care of children, and they traveled to England, and many were abandoned. And the similarities between the Asian men who also worked on steamships and they were abandoned. So they were very, very similar. And I thought this would be great to find out more about who these women were. And this is how it started. So it would be about 2014. But it took me quite a few years to complete that. So for me, I'm quite passionate about South Asian history because I have a South Asian background. My parents are originally from East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. And it always helps to know your background to be able to write these stories. And I think that's what made me have that connection where I could really write about South Asian history and also being South Asian, and I could connect with the culture and the heritage and the history.
Wow, subhanallah. So my heritage is also Southeast Asian. I'm from Kashmir, and I know there's a lot of like history there with India and Pakistan and Kashmir, and then there's this fight, and it's all over the place. And I have always wanted to learn more about it, but I never did it. And I feel like that's a huge loss on my heritage, on my identity. And the thing which I cling on to is the food. The food, it just reminds me of home, the smell of it, and my grandma's cooking, and the language parts of it. So I think it's really beautiful and so inspirational that as a person who, you've been raised in England, but you clung onto the heritage. But not only did you do that, you wrote a story about it. You wrote a story, subhanallah. That's just amazing. And my question, like, I've always wondered, and it's always intimidated me actually to write historical fiction, because the thoughts that come up for me, and I'm sure for so many of the listeners, are, what if the information is inaccurate? What if there are so many different sources of the same information? How can I reconcile that to write a fictional story in a world of, reality? So how did you do that?
Well, when we talk about historical fiction, it's based on past events, history, but the fiction side is you can make up a story and entertain your readers. Now, as you said, the historical aspect has to be accurate, because if you're going to write a story and you've got someone reading it, they will pick that up straight away, and it will ruin the whole story. They won't want to carry on focusing on what the story's about. So research is really, really important. You need to get it right. And alhamdulillah, lucky for me, I worked with historians. I spoke to different people who were experienced in that field. They even read what I had to write so I could get it completely accurate. And even when my book was being published and it was reviewed, and there was one slight inaccuracy which was corrected at a later date, but you really need to work with other people to get that right, because I think it's doing it on your own. I would say, I'm not a historian. I write stories, and that's the difference, because people say to me, oh, you must be a historian, you must know a lot about history. But no, I'm passionate about history. I've learned about my own culture, my own history, because I didn't know everything at the time. And I wrote a story, and I thought at the time that was the best way of educating people, educating history, South Asian history, through a fictional novel. And you won't get people picking up history books. It's only if you need it to look for, doing it for research or trying to find out something about it. But with historical fiction, that's the best way of educating people. And alhamdulillah, I was able to do that. And I have to say, it wasn't easy. It took me years to get my first book out. And even 10 years after my first book was published, and Ayah's Choice was published. So it does take a lot of, I would say, patience, persistence, and perseverance. You really have to be determined, that believe in it and say, I'm going to do this, and I want to do this with Allah's help. So for me, alhamdulillah, it made my dreams come true.
Alhamdulillah. That's amazing to hear. So there are multiple books that you have published. You began writing, from what I'm hearing, around over 10 years ago, maybe more closer to 15, right?
Yes, yes.
Subhanallah. So during that whole time, you said that one of your books took around 10 years. Is this the Ayah's Choice? And Ayah's
It
Choice?
did. It did. And the reason being, I found it difficult to write. There were times where I just didn't know what to write. I put it away for months, and then I did other things, and I came back. And I think any author, any writer will tell you the same thing. It's very difficult to write a story without taking a break from it. You always need to come back to it. And that's when you discover, I want to change this, or this isn't quite right. Let me revisit that and see what I can do with it. And that's what all writers do. The first draft takes a long time, and then you're revisiting it again and again. But after saying that, there has to be a line. You have to draw the line, because it can go on forever. And I came to a point when I thought, I can't do this anymore. I can't write anymore. This is it for me. Even when we got to the editing stage, I was asked to change certain parts of my book. And I said, I just don't know what else to write. I've exhausted it all. I can't do any more. So I think you all know at the time where, this is it. This is my book. And I want to now approach publishers or agents and see where I can get it. But it takes a lot of patience to do that.
10 years shows so much about you as a writer and your character as well, the perseverance, the endurance, the passion. And I heard you say exhausted it. But what I think might be an alternative to that is that there was no more that you needed to write. Everything that was supposed to come, the inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the information that you gained from all of the research, it was exactly how much it was supposed to be, and that was the time to write and publish the book. So I love how you said you just knew when the time was that, okay, no more, now I need to finish. So if you were to put that into words, I know that's the feeling, but if you were to put that into words for anyone who has been working on their draft for a very long time and they've coming to that stage of like, when do I know that I'm finished? What advice would you give to them?
So it's really important to work with an editor. You know, every writer, doesn't matter how good you are, even if you're a published author, you still need to work with an editor. You need to get them to read your book and look at your book and make sure that it reads well, it's grammatically correct, and also how the story flows. So I would advise, don't give it to your family or close friends, because they will simply say it's great. You know, no one is there to criticize. You need to give it to someone independent, someone who can help you crafting that book. And it's really, really important. But it does take time, and it won't happen overnight. Even when you come to the stage, it's been edited, and you want to send it out to agents and publishers, you know, you have to make sure it's 101%, I have to say, when you're ready for it, but be also prepared to make changes even after that. Because when you do start sending your book out, someone may say, well, this isn't quite right, or we decided we didn't want to take this on. And then you'll be tempted to change it, thinking, well, this person didn't like it, so maybe there's something wrong with it. But it's really important to know that, no, you know, you have to draw the line. Someone is going to like it. Not everyone is going to think the same. And it only takes that one yes to make your dream come true. So that's how I would sort of describe that.
Wow. And so your editor and the editor that you worked with, how did you know that this was the right person for you?
So I didn't just work with one editor. First of all, I started looking for someone who was experienced in historical fiction in editing. And this is exactly what I did. You can look at websites who they promote editors and editors looking for work. So I worked with one editor, and I felt at the time I didn't 100% agree with everything that she said. And then I decided to sort of revisit my book, make a few changes, and then approach another editor, because they're all different. You know, no one is the same. And it's really important to make sure you look at their background, you look at their credentials, and you know exactly what they're talking about. And not just an editor, they need to be experienced in the field that you're writing. So I think it's really important to look at their credentials and what the books that they've worked on. So alhamdulillah, I found some fantastic editors. They worked very well with me, even though I didn't agree with everything that they said. But at the end of the day, it's your book, and you decide what goes into that, not them. They can just advise, they can give you information, resources, anything else that they may direct you to, but it's your book, and you shape it the way that you want it.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. And there's a lot of, I'm sure in the beginning stages of when you were writing your book, you were doing your first draft, there was a lot of maybe just still exploring to happen, and the story was still being made. And we've had a couple of interviews on this for this conference, and they call themselves intuitive writers, which I also feel I'm an intuitive writer. But the idea is that you don't stick to the structure so much at the beginning. You literally like you're according to someone, Becca Symes, you're in a snow globe, and you're literally in the dark, and you're feeling your way through the story, right? And that part of the process is so vulnerable, it's so important, and it is so vital for the story to flesh out, you know. And then when you get that strength of structure, and then you come back to it, and then you begin to focus on, okay, now how can I tell this story? I know what's going to happen, how can I tell this story? Then it becomes a little bit stronger, and you become a little bit more stronger as well in the story. So have you ever given your work to someone at an earlier stage, and what did you learn from that, if you did? And what was the difference between you being sure of your story and giving it to someone to look over once it had marinated and it was ready?
So when you said there's no structure, you're absolutely right with that. You don't start writing and say, I'm going to write chapter 1, and then this is chapter 2. You write what comes to mind, and then you flesh it out. That's exactly what you do. And then the structure will eventually come through your story writing. Now, I would say the first 3 chapters for any book is probably the hardest chapters to write. And you need to get those chapters right, because as with any publisher or agent, they will read the first 3 chapters. Some of them will look at the whole book. But for me, I didn't approach any editor at that time. I thought, I'm going to write the whole book first. And I think it's easier, because you might write 3 chapters and then decide to give it to an editor for them to read. But then where does that sort of take you? I think you need to have a full manuscript ready for someone to have a look at. And I think that's what they would like to do. But there are people who send their early chapters and then get advice on how to do that. But for me, I think it worked when I completely finished it. And I would advise it should be around 80,000 words, if anything. Anything under that, you won't get a publisher to publish that. And that's where I would say it gets hard, because you're trying to flesh it out. You're looking at the word count, making sure, you know, how do I increase my word count? What else do I need to write? And I think that is probably the hardest bit, just getting those words down and making sure you produce a wonderful story.
Yes, and also just keeping in mind as well that there are different genres, and different genres have different number counts as well. So, for example, a non-fiction book will be very different to a sci-fi novel, for example. A historical fiction word count will be very different, and each publisher varies. So the most important thing is get the story on paper, make sure that you're ready. And I love that you said, make sure that, you know, it's better to have a full manuscript before you approach publishers. So jazakallah khair for that. So I wanted to also ask you, now you've completed the book, we've talked about your inspiration, we've talked about the research process, we've talked about the time that it took you, the time you've taken away, you needed for yourself in order to write this book, the fruition of it. You've worked with editors, not just one editor, but numerous editors. There's so many different types. And now it is ready. So what did you do next?
So when it was ready, we went into lockdown for the 2nd time.
Wow. Yeah.
And then that's what really propelled me to get this finished. You know, this is the time, we're at home a lot, let's do this. And I did that. That's exactly what propelled me to finish it completely. And then I started to approach publishers. It's really difficult to secure an agent, I would have to say. It's much, much harder to secure an agent. It's better to have an agent because they can sell your book for you. But for me, I decided I went down that route. It was very difficult, even after being published for the first time 10 years ago. It didn't matter if I had credentials. So I approached publishers. So I think it literally took me 7 months after writing to at least 60 publishers. And I created a spreadsheet, made sure that I knew who I was contacting. And it really does take time and effort. But you have to be patient, because some publishers take 3 months to get back to you. Some won't get back to you at all, and you just move on. And you've got to have thick skin. You know, some will criticize your work, but when we talk about publishing and books, it's all about, it's business. It's what the publishers can make out of you. And if they like it, and if they know that it's sellable, If they may like the book and then decide they won't be able to sell that. It's a different kind of subject. But as you said earlier, it really depends on the subject. Each subject has different criterias and how to do this. But I would strongly advise, please read the publisher's submissions, the guidelines, and do it to the letter. They if they want less, keep it less. If they want more, keep it more. Don't give them more than what they ask for. And it's really, really important, because they can see that you have followed their guidelines. And for those who don't, it's simply not looked at. So it's really, really important to follow their guides and their rules for you to have that chance for a publisher to read them. And don't be disheartened if you get rejections, because every author gets rejections. You've just got to simply move on. They didn't like it, that's fine. Someone will. Just keep moving on and keep doing it.
That's amazing advice. Thank you. So there's different processes. So did you decide to go traditional, or how did you go about this one?
So I looked for smaller publishers who published historical fiction. I think with the larger publishers, you do need to have an agent to even get your foot in the door there. And for me, it worked very well, because I approached a publisher. They got back to me in 2 weeks. They wanted to read the full manuscript. So originally I sent just 3 chapters. And then I had a Zoom call, and I got it the day that my son got COVID for the first time. And we were having to deal with that. And we're all isolating for 10 days, because in those early days we had to isolate as a family. And it was a sort of a bittersweet moment, because COVID had finally arrived in our house, but then I got this. So it was a, alhamdulillah, wonderful feeling to see the publisher say yes, they want to take that story forward. And they love that story. And I think that's the best feeling ever, where you want to scream it to the world, but you don't. You have to hold back. And I start telling people when it was almost ready for publication, I would say, when it was announced. But my family knew about that. So it's just a wonderful, wonderful feeling after all that hard work and effort. It really does pay off.
Of course. And it reminds me of hardship and ease. So there was a hardship of your son, and then Allah gave you a huge ease that you're able to carry forward, subhanAllah, and share with the world, kind of like another baby, right? That's what I think people call the book, like it's a baby. But yeah, subhanAllah. So you didn't tell people during the whole as it was being prepared for publication. Is there a reason for that?
For me, I think it's the Islamic perspective, where I didn't want to share things too soon. I always am conscious about the kind of information I share. I thought, let's be ready when the publishers decided that they want to share that, I will share that. So it's always exciting to want to share wonderful news, but I've always sort of been reserved in that aspect. And I'm always careful about how I share my stories and the work that I do, but I share my work for an audience. And it's different on social media, where that is most of the sharing that I do. It's about my work, it's about my writing. So for me, it's being reserved and not letting people know too soon. It's a blessing Allah that Allah has given me, alhamdulillah, but always be reserved, where there are people out there who simply may not like your work. You're going to get that. You're going to get those criticisms, but it's you, and it really is down to you how you want to share that. But for me, it's just, I always had that thought: what if it doesn't happen, or it gets pulled and I've shared it to the whole world? These things can happen. So I thought, let's wait. Let's be patient. I've waited this long. Let's wait until the right moment, and then I can share that.
That's such good advice. I agree with you. There's this feeling that sometimes when you're so excited, you just want to share with the world. And there's a lot of advice that goes around when you're working on a novel, for example. Share the process, as you're writing, tell people what you're doing as you're going through the process. And we spoke to another author who she's traditionally published, and she was giving advice as well. And she was just saying how a lot of people, they'll call it they will call it a secret project that they're doing, which kind of gets everyone excited at the same time, but you're still not sharing. And I was like, that feels much more aligned to me, because I feel very similar to the way you do, I'm sure, about being more reserved in sharing certain things, because I don't feel that everyone should have that place in your life, especially when not everyone is safe. I mean, it's beautiful that so many people can be so open and vulnerable with the world about their own, whatever they choose to share. But for me personally, it isn't me. And I love that you've accepted that part of yourself as well. So when it comes to marketing, how do you reconcile being authentic to your message and choosing what you share with the world? How do you merge the two?
So I think when my book was finally announced, it was coming out, and obviously it took months for it to finally be published. So I think before it was released, I started to share messages. Everyone knew I was writing a second book. You know, it was common knowledge. Everyone knew that. And then I finally announced the title. But I have to say the title came much later, because it was originally called India Inc. Okay, and that was right at the beginning, and I thought, you know, that I'm not sure about that. You know, is it going to work? And it tells a story of an Indian ayah called Jaya, and she was an artist. So I thought India and ink, and then I thought no, and then I had people saying an ayah is an Arabic verse, and I had to sort of explain, you know, it's got nothing to do with the Quran or nothing to do with Islam. You know, it's a story about an ayah. They were Indian nannies. So for me, marketing, it was getting the message out, because at the end of the day, you want people to read your story, to buy your book, and it's how you share those messages, not those messages to say, hey, I'm publishing my book. Tell people about the story and make sure you attract people to the story. And it really does depend on how you share that message. Tell them about the background, tell them about the history, for something that they can really enjoy. And that's exactly what I did. And alhamdulillah, it was great. People received it well. And I think it's people can see it through your messages. You know, what is the message that you're trying to tell people, and people pick up on that. So even to this day, I still I like to show people when I go to events, or I do conferences, or talk about my story, talk about history, and it's something that I can sort of advertise my book with at the same time, because I do lots of different things, but it's how I share, how I want the audience to see what I'm doing, and how I'm continuing to not just write but also do other things, which makes it more broad and interesting as well at the same time.
It does, it does. And I noticed that as well, that you do so many different things as well. And so it's like being a woman, and then you wear many hats at the same time. So I think it's amazing. And I had another question. So Allahumma barik, what made you choose the name and Ayah's Choice? I know you touched on that a little bit, but when I read the title, it stood out to me. I didn't think it was like an Islamic. I thought it was like a play on words a little bit. So what inspired the name?
Well, the story is about Anaya and her choice of freedom. And I thought
So
it
the
was
theme.
one of my editors. Yes, one of my editors. She suggested that. I have to say that. So it didn't come from myself, because I was really stuck on the title. The title is the giveaway. The title will describe the book, and she suggested that. So I looked back on it and I thought, yes, you know, this really tells the story of Anaya, her choice of being free, her freedom, independence. And it was a short title. And I think that's what sealed it in the end. You know, that was it for me. And I loved it. And I thought, yeah, this is fantastic. And it really is very important to get that title right, because people look at the title, you know, what it's about. If it's too long, it says it all. But I just wanted to keep it really simple. And Aya's choice is Jaya's choice as an Ayah, what she wanted to do.
That's so deep. That's so powerful. And I have a question about any upcoming books. Is there going to be a part 2? Is it going to be a
Uh,
prequel?
Yes, so I'm working on book 3 at the moment, and this would be I'm really moving away from South Asian history. So it's a character that was in my first book, Lascar.
Mm.
She was an Italian woman who danced with Alaska when they were making money to try and survive. I wanted to concentrate on her. So we're bringing in Italian history because I don't want to be typecast just writing South Asian history. It's very easy to, but I
Mhm,
thought, let me write something differently, something that I've not written before.
mhm,
I did research at the time with my first book, but Italians settled in East London in the Victorian era, and I thought, let me tell her story. So I'm working on that. And again, every time you do write a new story, it never gets easier. It does not. It doesn't matter how many times it's been published. You think, okay, is it going to be similar to my other books? Or, you don't want it to be similar to your other books because people have read that. They want something new from you.
mm,
And people expect authors to just churn out books year after year. But I think, inshallah, by spring next year, I hope it to be complete. And then I will be out there again, going through that same process of finding a publisher. So yes, I'm not going to leave it 10 years. Hopefully, inshallah, in the next couple of years, to see book 3. Alhamdulillah.
Inshallah, inshallah. May Allah make it successful. I mean, and
Thank
bless
you.
every endeavor that you take, and being able to tell a story of freedom, right? And Ayah's choice
Yes.
is really about freedom. And the advice that you would give to writers, anyone who is watching this, what advice would you give to them as an author who has been published, and as an author who is writing your new book? What key lesson and advice would you give to all of us?
So I would advise to keep reading.
Mhm,
Read lots of different genres. Reading really helps you to develop your style, what you want to write, and you need to look at what other authors are writing and their style. And the more you read, the more it will help you in the long run. And
mhm,
also do your research. That is paramount. You have to do your research. Everyone wants to write a story. I'm sure there are people out there who just simply don't know where to start. But write what you feel comfortable with and what you know. It's always important to write what you know
mhm,
and do the research and work with editors, work with other people, people who can advise, because sometimes it can feel like a lonely world being a writer and an author, but there are so many organizations and groups like yourselves as well to advise and help writers, especially being a Muslim woman writer and from
mhm.
an ethnic minority background. There are barriers, but we want to make our voices heard, so let's do this.
Yes, yes. Jazakallah khair for that amazing advice, Sister Shahida Rahman. And we are so happy to have you here with us to share your wisdom. And I really hope our viewers are inspired. I definitely was inspired. So
Thank
Jazakallah
you.
khair. And where can we find you? Where can we find your work?
So just go on my website, shahidarahman.co.uk. I'm not difficult to find. And do have a look at the work that I do, as well as not just writing, but I do other things as well. And it's great to have, as you said before, wear different hats and also bring something different to different audiences. So do check me out. Thank you.